Welcome to the DevOps channel. In this episode, we are going to look at a very interesting use case. Very often we come across situation wherein there are microservices that don't have an authorization layer on top of these microservices to protect them, right? Typically, the protection is basically done by whitelisting certain IPs or whitelisting an AWS account number or something like that. In an enterprise setup, this is not considered secure enough, right? So for reasons of audit, security would like to see an audit trail of requests coming in to the microservices with timestamps and so on, right? So in this episode, we're going to look at how you can use a combination of both AWS API Gateway and Cognito to create a layer of authorization on top of your microservices without making any changes to your microservice itself, right? So let's get started. Okay, so this is the scenario we have. We have a service B in AWS account B. For the sake of this use case, we are going to assume that it is in US East region 1. Service B is going to expose some kind of an API that it wants Service A to consume. Service A is in a different AWS account. It's also in US East region. So they both are in the same region. Now Service A is going to consume the the API that's exposed by Service B. Okay. And both of these are backend services. These are kind of, not user interfaces or something. These are backing services, headless services. Okay. Now this is our use case. We want to be able to establish some kind of authorization layer between service A and service B so that we have an audit trail of who is calling service B. All right. So for that, now as you can see in this diagram, right, there is no trust beyond the VPC endpoints that are kind of established over here. So service A uses the VPC endpoint to get to service B. Essentially, VPC endpoint service is just nothing but AWS way of whitelisting this particular account for invocations to be made to account B, right? So for most situations, probably this might work, but in an enterprise setup with a stringent security kind of audit requirements, this generally will not pass an audit. So we need some kind of an authorization layer sitting over here that can actually validate requests coming in based on some short-lived tokens. So what is the solution, right? So let's look at how we want to kind of solution this, right? So the first thing we'll do is we'll set up something like this. Okay, let's focus first on what we do in account B over here. We're going to set up something. We are going to set up an API gateway and Cognito in account B, and then before we do that, we have to do a prerequisite in account A. What we'll do is we have to create a VPC endpoint for API gateway in account A, and then that will result in an VPC endpoint ID. Use that ID and save it somewhere, and then when you set up the API gateway over here, we have to use this endpoint ID in the resource policy over here in the API gateway, so that the API gateway knows that it can trust invocations coming from this, right? This is all a private link, right? So we just kind of update the resource policy with this VPC endpoint ID, and when we deploy the API gateway. And Cognito user pool, when we deploy Cognito user pool, we are going to have one client for this Cognito user pool. So it's called as a client app. So if you look at this scenario, these are machine to machine kind of scenarios. So the OAuth grant type that we are going to use is called as client credentials grant type, and Cognito is going to create a client credentials for this particular application. Like for each one of your client, you can create one client app. So this will result in a client ID and secret, and you have to provide that to service A. So once we provide that to service A, what will happen is that when Cognito is set up, it has a token endpoint that it will create just for this particular user pool. So service A will invoke that particular endpoint, which is a FIPS enabled public endpoint unique to this particular Cognito user pool. It can also be a custom domain, but once you have that URL, service A is going to basically invoke that endpoint and present its client ID and secret to generate a short-lived token. And that token is going to be used by service A whenever it's going to basically invoke anything on service B, wherein it is going to send that token as part of the HTTP request. So when the request lands up in the API gateway, the API gateway is going to validate the token against Cognito, and if the token is valid, it will let the request go through. Otherwise, it's going to stop it here, thus acting as some kind of an authorization layer over here, right? And another point to be noted is that when the API gateway is deployed, the URL of the API gateway can be used directly by service A to actually send request to to consume the services from B. Or you can also use the URL that you get out of the endpoint URL or the VPC endpoint. You can use either one of these URL. You could use this URL, or you can use the API gateway provided URL, and both will end up in the same kind of request. Okay, so how are we going to test this, right? So what we'll do is we'll set up an EC2 in the subnets that are associated with this endpoint, and from there we are going to issue a curl command, and that will invoke the API gateway. So that will use either this VPC endpoint URL, or it can use the API gateway URL, and it will send in the request, right? What we'll do is we'll first generate the token. We'll hit the Cognito URL, generate the token, and then use that token as a authorization header in our HTTP request that goes to the API gateway, right? Now the second step is in the account B. For the sake of simplicity, will not deploy service B. What we'll do is we'll set up this API gateway to invoke a publicly available API. There are plenty of APIs available on the public domain to just return some results, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to use that API, and the API gateway will act as an authorization layer, and if the tokens are all valid, it will invoke the public API, which is guaranteed to return some results. If not, it will just deny that request, right? So that's going to be our setup, and let's get started. So what we'll do is we'll deploy this API gateway and Cognito using Terraform. We just use one module and just deploy the whole thing as one module. We'll call it an authorization module. And then once we deploy this, we're going to go and check the resources that it creates. And then we'll basically log into this EC2 instance, and we'll use the token. We'll first create a token using Postman, and we'll use that token over here and invoke this API gateway. Okay, so let's actually get down to the code. As we discussed, so first we need to create the prerequisite, which is the creation of an endpoint in account A. So what we are going to do is this is account A, and in account A I am in the endpoint screen here on the VPC tab and we'll go ahead and create an endpoint. So we will name this endpoint let's say auth test, and then from the services you just type execute, and you should get the execute API to choose from. So this is the one you need to choose. And for the VPC, I had set up a demo VPC for this, so I'm using that. And you have to kind of provide two subnets. So I will choose these two private subnets. And the rest is kind of, I'll take it as default. And the most important thing is you'll just need to make note of this ID after it's been created, because this ID is going to be used in the resource policy in the API gateway in account B when we set it up. Okay, so let's create this endpoint. So it is pending creation. So it should take some time. Meanwhile, I've also set up the EC2 instance that I was talking about. We need an EC2 instance to test this. So there is one EC2 instance we have over here, which is in the same subnet that we are using for setting up the endpoint. So this is the subnet that we one of the subnet that we used at 3A. Okay, so that's all you need to do. Just to recap, what we just did was, let me go back to my presentation. So we were in service account A. In this account, we created an EC2 instance. We created a VPC endpoint, and we're going to make a note of this VPC endpoint when we use it when we are setting up this API gateway over here. Okay. The endpoint got created. We just make a copy of this endpoint ID, and this is what we are going to use when we set up the Cognito and the API gateway in AWS account B. Okay. Now we are going to use Terraform to create basically the Cognito user pool and the AWS API gateway. So I'll just briefly go over the Terraform code. So we created a module called auth module, and all this code is going to be in the links below. So don't worry about that. So what is this auth module, right? So this is a module that we are going to use to set up basically the entire, authorization setup in account B. So let's look at what is there inside the auth module. The first piece that you want to see is that API itself. So this is going to this part of the module is going to deploy the API, and what this API is going to do is it is basically creating a method which will just proxy. It's creating a HTTP method called any, and it's going to basically proxy anything that any request that comes in and to the underlying service. So it just act as a pass through basically, and all it's doing is it's acting as a pass through, but as a prerequisite it's also installing a Cognito user pool as the authorizer for this particular API method, right? So that's all this entire code is doing. Okay, and what it's doing here, this part is it's kind of whitelisting the source endpoint, and this is the VPC endpoint that we had actually created in the previous step, right? So it's just basically creating this resource policy so that it can whitelist that particular endpoint when it basically gets an invocation, right? So it will allow that invocation based on that and the token being presented. Now this is the user pool over here. This code creates the user pool. So what we are saying is that we want the OAuth type to be client credentials, grant type to be supported, and pretty much nothing else is happening here. It creates another thing called as an app client. You see this one, it is an app client here, and this app client is basically going to be for each. So it's using a for each method. So you can create as many app clients as you want. In our case, we are just creating one app client for this API. So that's what is going to be created for this user pool. Okay, and logs. So this is basically for audit reasons. We want to enable logging on that entire invocation that happens on the API gateway. So this is basically what this piece is doing. So all this is bundled inside one auth module, and what we'll do is we'll call it from an environment called dev. So this is all we are doing. So we are just initializing our AWS provider, and we are initializing this auth module over here, and we are passing it the name of the pool. This is the user Cognito user pool name. We need to provide something called as a resource server name, and then basically the scope for the resource server, and then this is the name of the client, app client. So we'll just call it client A, and this is the Cognito domain that we are going to use. This domain is basically the as I told you, it's a FIPS enabled custom domain that is going to be created for this particular user pool. So this is just like a prefix for that domain. Okay, so when you see the entire domain, this will just be one part of the entire domain. Okay, and the name of the API, we are just calling it demo API wrapper. And this is a VPC endpoint. This is exactly the endpoint that we just created in the previous step. So we are just kind of, passing it as a parameter, and region. And now here, this is the interesting part. As I told you, we are not going to deploy a service inside this account. We're just going to wrap this over a publicly available API. So this is basically tradestie.com. This API basically is available. I think it provides some sentiment analysis on a few trades or a few stocks from Reddit. So we are going to look at the results when we kind of invoke this. So don't worry about that. It could be anything. There are lots of publicly traded APIs. You can publicly available APIs that you can use. So this is just one example. Okay, and auth scope is basically, this is the one that we are saying, right? This JSON read and this particular resource server. This is going to be our auth scope. Okay, and we are going to output the client ID and secret when we create this thing. So let's start by initializing our Terraform. Then we will say Terraform plan. Okay, it's going to create these 15 resources. These are the resources we just talked about. So I'm going to apply. So this should create all the resources we just talked about, and then we are going to log in and look at all the resources that we just created. Okay, so just to give it a few more minutes, so it's going to take some time. Meanwhile, I just want to kind of show the presentation again, just to see what just to provide more context of what we are doing. So this is exactly what it is doing right now. We updated the resource policy with the VPC ID. It's deploying the API gateway, and it's deploying the Cognito, and it's also creating the app client for Cognito. Okay, so these are the few things that it's creating, and it's also going to update the cloud resource policy for to be able to log into CloudWatch and all that kind of stuff, right? So it just created everything. So now we are going to do a Terraform output. And since these are sensitive, we need to give the name of the credentials Cognito output. So let's do that. So these are the client. This is the client ID, and this is the secret. So this is what we are going to use when we generate this token. Okay, so we just need to make note of this, and then we are going to use this to generate the OAuth token, and this token is the one that's going to be presented. So let's go back to the diagram. So if you look at it, the client credentials are going to be used over here, and those are going to be presented against the FIPS enabled endpoint in Cognito to generate the token. And once the token is there, the second step will be to present the token along with the API call, and the API gateway is going to authorize that token against Cognito. If it's a valid token, it'll hit the public API that we just kind of have over here, right? And it will pass in the parameters that you're going to pass from the test program. Okay, so yeah, so let's test it out. Let's first log into the AWS and see what it has created, and then we are going to go into our EC2 instance and then start our test. We're going to log into account B and just verify what was created using Terraform. So this is basically what we created, 15 resources. So just going to look at this. One was the API gateway that was set up. So we have this API gateway, as I mentioned, there's a proxy method, any, and this is what we have in terms of the authorizer, which is a Cognito user pool. and pretty much this is the scope we talked about. And what we have done is kind of this is deployed as a stage over here. So this is the URL that the caller can use to invoke this API, or he can use the API of the VPC endpoint itself. So we, for convenience sake, we're just going to use this API, this URL, when we actually invoke this API for testing. Okay. And with regards to kind of settings and all, I think it's pretty much as we had expected. So this is the ARN we had created for the CloudWatch. So pretty much this, everything looks good. So authorizer again is the Cognito user pool authorizer that we actually created. So now let's go quickly look at the Cognito setup that was created for this particular example. So we have this demo pool that it created, and then we have what we wanted to see was the app experience. So let's look at the app integration. So we created a client A. I mean, if you look at the Terraform code here, we see that we wanted to create a client A. This is the OAuth client. So app here, the app client is basically, this is the client ID, and it has a secret that is the one we are going to use to generate the token. And pretty much I think everything looks good. Now all we need to do is just use this client ID and secret to generate a token, and then present that token towards the API endpoint that we just looked at over here. In this API, you go here, and we are presenting the token to this particular URL that's created, right? This is the stage that we set up in our Terraform for this particular API. So let's get started with the actual demo and testing. So we'll SSH into the before we SSH into the EC2 instance and start the testing, we need to generate the token. So I'm going to use Postman to generate the token, and then we'll basically paste that token into a curl request that will issue from the EC2 instance that's in the one of those subnets. Okay. Another important piece of information we want to go over is the URL of the token endpoint. So as you can see, here this is the prefix that we had wanted for the Cognito user pool. So this is the this is what we had provided in the Terraform code over here. If you remember, this is the string. This exact same string is used to create this particular URL, and this is the URL wherein we are going to present a base64 encoded format of the client ID and secret to generate the token. Once the token is generated, we're going to make the API call with the token as the authorization header. And then just let's see what happens when we do that from the EC2 instance in account A. Now we're going to use Postman to generate the token. So as we looked in the previous step, this is the domain or the URL that Cognito has set up for us. We're going to add OAuth 2 and token to that particular URL because we are going to hit the token endpoint. And among the parameters that needs to be passed, one is called as a grant type. So we set up this pool with the support for client credentials grant type. So we're going to say client credentials here. And then the client ID is the same thing that was generated for us in Terraform. So if you look at this, this is the client ID that we got as an output. So we're going to use that client ID. And then the scope is the same as the scope we used in our code, which is basically this is the scope. This is the OAuth scope. So we are going to provide that OAuth scope as well as a parameter. Now going to the authorization or the headers part of it. So here we are going to add an authorization header over here. Now this basically is a result of the base64 encoding of the client ID and secret. So let me just quickly show you what that is. So if you look at it here, so this is the client ID and this is the secret, and I put a colon in between, and when I say encode, this is the result I get. So I'm just going to use this result inside this particular authorization header over here. So this is the result over here, and the content type is application / whatever, right? So now I'm going to send this request. This is a post request to get a token to this Cognito endpoint and see if we can generate this token. Once we have this token, then we can move on to the next step of actually submitting the API request along with the token to get some responses back. So after this step, we are going to get into the EC2 instance and send a request from the EC2 instance. So let's send a request to get the token, and we'll make a note of this token. Okay, so boom. So now we got the token back. So this is the token. So what we are going to do is we are going to copy this token, and then we are going to go back into our EC2 instance, and from that EC2 instance we are going to invoke this particular in the API endpoint, and we'll present this token along with our request, and that should basically hit the invocation. So if we are going to basically we just did this step over here. We got this token. Now we are going to go into this EC2 instance, and we are going to basically hit this API gateway endpoint, and then provide that token in our present that token in our service call, and that should result in a call to the public API that we listed here, right? So that is what we're going to do next. So we are back to the final step of the test. So what we are going to do is we are here in the EC2 instance, and what we are going to do is we are going to issue the curl command from this EC2 instance using the token that we created in the previous step. So just to recap, so this is what we are going to do. So we are in the EC2 instance over here, and we generated a token in the first step here, right? So we are going to copy that token, and we are going to use the EC2 instance to issue the curl command to this API gateway endpoint. And if everything goes well, the API gateway should validate the token against this Cognito user pool. And if the token is valid, it should go and hit the public API over here that returns some stock analysis or sentiments from the popular website Reddit, and we should see some results. Okay, so let's get let's issue that curl command. So I have the curl command ready. So let's see basically what it looks like. So this is the curl command. So here is the URL of up until UAT is the URL of the stage that was set up in API gateway. We appended apps and Reddit to it, and that will be basically equivalent to this part over here. So apps and Reddit is going to be appended over here for the underlying system, right? So this is the URL we are going to hit, and this is the proxy part that is going to be appended, right? So this is the part that goes into that URL, and the header is again the authorization header that we generated in the previous step, and again we are giving the header type to be content type application JSON. Okay, so let's issue this command, this curl command, and see what happens. Boom. So we basically have some results. So we are seeing some bullish sentiments on few stocks like Tesla, and we are seeing various stock analysis sentiments on various stocks. So that's all that we needed to do basically. So so this is how you can add a layer of authorization on top of your microservices, and using our API gateway and Cognito. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and feel free to comment, and all the code is going to be in the links below, so make sure you check it out. Okay, as the last part of this video, I just wanted to show you how the logs for the CloudWatch API are logging the requests that we sent through the curl. So here you can see that I just opened one of the logs. So you can see that the authorization was completed, and then there was basically this is the proxy we talked about, like apps Reddit, it went to apps Reddit. So this is basically 200 response. So this is the kind of audit that security would be interested in for scanning and for reporting or kind of analysis on security events and so on. So this is what our intent was, to generate some kind of an audit log for or rather a trail of who is hitting the API and what are the kind of timestamps in which the API is getting executed, right? So yep. Friends, if you liked and enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it, and definitely subscribe. Thank you.